Anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions because when it rises, it is loud, visible, and often uncontrollable. It is the sudden fire that bursts out of a person, and we can all recognize it in a raised voice, a slammed door, or a heated argument. But here is the truth. Anger, as fiery as it may seem, is temporary. It's a storm that comes, shakes everything around it, and then eventually passes. That's why when two people argue, hours later they can still find space for forgiveness or at least calm. Anger burns, but it burns quickly. It's like a spark on dry grass. Dangerous, yes, but short-lived. The energy of anger demands expression. It pushes a person to release it, and once it's released, it weakens. But hatred is not like that. Hatred is the decision to hold on. It is anger that never let go, anger that got buried instead of being released, and because it stayed inside, it turned into something deeper and far more dangerous. Hatred is permanent because it isn't about reaction anymore. It becomes a choice, a lifestyle, and even an identity for some people. When someone is angry at you, they are reacting to a moment, something specific you did or said. But when someone hates you, their emotion has outlived the moment. It has disconnected from the original reason and now exists on its own. That's why hatred is like poison. It doesn't need a reason to continue existing. It just feeds itself, living inside the person who chose not to let go. Anger can still be healed through dialogue, reconciliation, or time, but hatred shuts the door to all of those possibilities. Hatred refuses to heal. Think about how many relationships end, not because of the first moment of anger, but because that anger was stored, replayed, and watered until it grew into hatred. Two people can argue, but if they release that anger, they can reconnect. If instead one of them decides to hold the wound close, replaying it again and again, anger transforms into hatred, and once hatred settles in, it is not temporary anymore. That's why hatred is more dangerous. It outlasts the event, it outlasts the memory, and it outlasts the relationship. Anger is a natural emotion. It is like the body's response to pain. It signals that something is wrong. But hatred is an unnatural state. It's when someone decides to hold on to the pain, polish it, revisit it, and build their life around it. Hatred can wake a person up in the morning and guide their decisions throughout the day. They might think of ways to sabotage, ways to undermine, or even ways to smile in front of the person they despise while secretly rejoicing at their downfall. Anger would never last that long, but hatred thrives in silence, in waiting, in long-term focus. To really understand the difference, imagine two fires. Anger is like a bonfire. It roars, it burns, and it consumes quickly, but eventually the flames reduce to ash. Hatred is like coal buried deep underground. It doesn't roar, it doesn't make noise, but it stays hot, it stays alive, and it can last for years, slowly burning and waiting for the right condition to explode. One destroys quickly, the other destroys slowly, but hatred destroys more completely because it never leaves room for repair. And here's the critical part, because anger is temporary, it can still be managed, guided, or even turned into something positive like passion or motivation to create change. But hatred gives no such gift. Hatred is a disease of the mind that blinds the heart. It never seeks resolution. It never asks, how can we fix this? Instead, it thrives on permanence. Hatred whispers, never forgive, never forget, never release. And those who listen to that voice end up locked in their own prison, unable to experience peace or growth because they chose to keep a permanent flame burning within themselves. This is why anger, though dangerous, can sometimes be useful. It can serve as a warning, a push to address an issue. But hatred seeks nothing but destruction. It's dangerous because while anger passes, hatred doesn't. It's dangerous because while anger is an emotion, hatred becomes a mindset. It reshapes how a person thinks, how they see the world, how they interact with others. Once someone embraces hatred, every word, every action, every glance gets filtered through that dark lens. It's not just a storm anymore, it's the climate they live in. So when we say anger is temporary and hatred is permanent, we're not just talking about time. We're talking about destiny. Because anger, when released, gives space for healing. Hatred, when held, closes the door to healing. One can be forgiven, the other resists forgiveness. One can create a moment of conflict, the other creates a lifetime of war. That's why hatred is always more dangerous. It lives longer, digs deeper, and costs far more than anger ever could. When most people think of hatred, they imagine it looking like anger, shouting, fighting, or open hostility. But hatred rarely shows its true face that way. Anger is loud, expressive, and it demands attention, while hatred is patient and subtle. Hatred has a way of hiding in plain sight, masquerading as silence, as calm, or even as kindness. This is what makes it so dangerous, because you cannot always see it coming. A person filled with hatred might sit at the same table with you, smile politely, and even nod in agreement, but deep inside they are storing up resentment, plotting ways to strike when you least expect it. Unlike anger that explodes and burns out, hatred pretends to be quiet, but its silence is heavy and poisonous. Silence can be healing when it is born out of peace, but silence born from hatred is not peaceful. It is deceptive. It's the silence of someone who has made a decision to carry bitterness without letting it show. When anger is present, you can see it in a person's tone, their gestures, their body language. You can sense the fire burning in them. But hatred is more calculating. It knows how to hide behind calm expressions, behind a composed demeanor. Someone might never raise their voice, never show a trace of agitation, yet deep inside they are nurturing hatred like a hidden weapon. This makes hatred more dangerous than anger, because at least with anger, you know where you stand. If a person is angry with you, they reveal it. They argue, they confront, they express it openly. Even if it's unpleasant, at least the truth is visible. But hatred disguises itself, which means you may never know when it will surface or how it will strike. A person who hates you can sit in silence for years, allowing you to believe that everything is fine, while inside they are feeding their grudge and waiting for the perfect opportunity to hurt you. That silence is not peace, it is preparation. Hatred masquerading as silence also means it has no urgency to resolve the situation. Anger still seeks a release. Anger wants to get it out, to express, to find some closure. But hatred is comfortable staying hidden. It can rest in the background for years, because hatred doesn't seek expression, it seeks destruction. This is why hatred is so deceptive, because when it hides in silence, it can catch others off guard. People can be fooled into believing reconciliation has happened, when in truth, hatred never forgave, never let go, never softened. In human relationships, this silent hatred is often more damaging than any argument. Couples, friends, family members, or colleagues may go through anger and fights, but if they can express that anger, there is hope to rebuild. Silence, however, can be deadly. When hatred hides behind silence, it creates distance, mistrust, and invisible walls. You might think the relationship is just quiet, when in reality it is filled with hidden resentment. And because silence doesn't draw attention the way anger does, people often underestimate it, not realizing that beneath the calm exterior, a storm is brewing. One of the most powerful masks hatred wears is politeness. Someone can smile at you, agree with you, even act supportive, while inside they despise you. They may shake your hand, but their heart is clenched tight with bitterness. This false calmness is dangerous because it makes hatred invisible until the moment it reveals itself in betrayal, sabotage, or sudden cruelty. You see, anger tells you, I am against you right now. Hatred tells you nothing. It waits, it watches, and it pretends. That's why hatred can feel like a knife in the back. It hides until the strike. Hatred also thrives in silence because silence gives it space to grow. The longer something is left unspoken, the stronger it becomes. An angry word spoken out loud can lose its power once it's expressed, but hatred left in silence multiplies because there is no outlet. It circles the mind, replaying the same memories, reinforcing the same grudges, until silence becomes its shelter. It is in this silence that hatred matures, hardens, and becomes nearly unshakable. There is also another kind of silence that hatred wears, the silence of withdrawal. Instead of shouting or confronting, hatred chooses to disappear, to cut off communication, to punish others with distance. It is a silence that speaks volumes without words. It says, I don't want resolution. I don't want to work through you. Unlike anger, which can ignite a conversation, hatred's silence kills conversation. It kills connection. It shuts the door and locks it, making sure no reconciliation is possible. The most dangerous part of this masquerade is that silence can fool even the person carrying hatred. Someone may tell themselves they are over it simply because they no longer feel angry or no longer express rage. But in truth, what they are carrying is not healing but hardened hatred. They confuse silence with peace, but the silence is only suppressing the poison that still lives within them. This is why hatred masquerading as silence is so destructive. It not only deceives others, it deceives the one who carries it, making them believe they have moved on when in reality, they are still chained to bitterness. And so hatred's greatest disguise is its ability to look calm, look composed, and look harmless on the surface, while inside it is plotting, calculating, and waiting. Its silence is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of danger, of hidden resentment, of a storm that has chosen not to roar, but to wait. Hatred can sit quietly in a room full of laughter. It can smile in a family picture. It can show up at a wedding or a dinner, pretending to blend in, all the while hiding the fact that it has no intention of healing, only of destroying when the time is right. When anger rises, it often demands an outlet. A person who is angry wants to speak, to argue, to fight, to slam the door, to express what they feel. In its own way, anger seeks resolution, even if the path is messy and filled with conflict. That's why anger can sometimes lead to reconciliation. Because once it's out, once it's expressed, the energy behind it begins to dissolve. But hatred is different. Hatred does not want resolution. It is not seeking an answer. It is not looking for peace. It is not asking for closure. Hatred seeks only one thing: destruction. It wants the other person to suffer, to fail, to feel pain. While anger can still say, I want to fix this, even if I'm upset. Hatred says, I don't want to fix this. I want to break it forever. That's why hatred is far more dangerous. It has no interest in moving forward. It thrives only when something is being torn down. When someone is angry, they may raise their voice or express disappointment. Even though it feels uncomfortable, it still reveals an openness to engagement. But when hatred takes over, it no longer cares about communication. It no longer cares about repairing. Instead, it wants to see the other person lose, to see them stripped of dignity, to see them fall apart. Hatred does not argue for resolution. It plots for destruction. It looks for opportunities to sabotage, to ruin, to weaken. This is the clearest difference between anger and hatred. Anger wants release, but hatred wants revenge. Hatred is not impulsive like anger. Anger erupts in the moment, but hatred plans. It thinks long term. It is patient. Someone who hates you may never show it outwardly. They may even act supportive, but behind the scenes, they quietly seek ways to bring you down. That could be spreading rumors in silence, blocking your opportunities without you knowing, or pretending to be neutral while feeding negativity against you. This kind of destructive intent is what makes hatred more poisonous than anger. Anger may hurt your feelings or create temporary chaos, but hatred works behind the curtain, silently removing the foundations of your stability. Another reason hatred seeks destruction instead of resolution is because hatred is never satisfied with fairness. Anger can cool down once the person feels heard, once justice is restored, or once an apology is made. But hatred doesn't care about fairness. Hatred doesn't stop when it sees balance. Hatred wants to go further, to see the target crushed, embarrassed, ruined. It's not about healing the wound, it's about deepening it until there is no return. That is why hatred keeps grudges alive long after the original issue is forgotten. It feeds on the very idea of someone else's downfall. Think about the destructive energy hatred carries. In families, hatred between siblings doesn't just cause fights. It causes lifelong divisions, inheritance battles, and broken bloodlines. In communities, hatred doesn't just lead to arguments. It leads to violence, crime, even wars. On a personal level, hatred doesn't just cause someone to be upset with you. It can push them to actively search for ways to ruin your career, your reputation, or your peace of mind. That's because hatred has no vision for resolution. Its only vision is destruction. And the tragedy of hatred is that it destroys both ways. While the person who carries hatred is trying to bring someone else down, they themselves are decaying inside. The more they obsess over causing pain, the more they trap themselves in bitterness. But hatred is so deceptive, it convinces the carrier that they are powerful by holding on to it. In reality, they are being eaten alive from within, because hatred never truly harms the target alone. It corrodes the soul of the one who carries it. Yet, even in this self-destruction, hatred refuses resolution. It does not seek healing, because healing would mean letting go, and hatred thrives on never letting go. Unlike anger, hatred does not want a conversation. You cannot reason with hatred. You cannot negotiate with it, because it has already made a choice. It doesn't want things better. It wants things worse. That's why hatred is more dangerous than anger in every form. Because where anger at least has the potential to lead to growth or forgiveness, hatred closes every door. Hatred doesn't want to talk. It doesn't want to understand. It doesn't want to reconcile. It wants to see something destroyed, and it will rest only when that destruction happens. And when hatred gets carried from one person to another, from one family to another, or from one generation to another, it becomes even more destructive. Whole groups can live bound to hatred, teaching it, passing it on, keeping it alive. Unlike anger, which burns out in a short while, hatred can outlive the people who first carried it, because destruction can be handed down as a mission. That's why hatred is more dangerous than any temporary burst of anger. It does not burn quickly and vanish. It digs roots deep, spreads, and poisons. So while anger can still lead to apologies, growth, and lessons learned, hatred offers none of that. It doesn't want repair. It doesn't want resolution. It doesn't want release. Its only purpose is destruction. It sits quietly waiting for the moment it can harm, and until it does, it keeps the one carrying it restless, obsessed, and consumed with bitterness. That's why hatred is never to be underestimated. It isn't just the shadow of anger. It's anger that has chosen to abandon resolution and live only for destruction. Hatred does not simply appear out of thin air. It is not a sudden explosion like anger, which rises quickly when someone feels insulted, hurt, or betrayed. Hatred grows slowly, step by step, through the constant repetition of thoughts. It begins with a small wound, a memory, or a negative experience. Instead of being released or healed, that memory is replayed again and again in the mind, each time becoming more vivid, more detailed, more emotionally charged. Every replay is like pouring water on a seed. Over time, the seed becomes roots, the roots become branches, and before long, hatred has grown into a full tree inside the heart. The danger lies in the repetition. What you repeatedly dwell on, you eventually believe. And what you believe, you eventually live by. Hatred feeds on this cycle until it becomes inseparable from the person carrying it. When something painful happens, the mind naturally revisits it. But when someone chooses not to let go, they move from revisiting to rehearsing. They begin to rehearse the conversation that offended them, the betrayal that hurt them, the humiliation they experienced. In their mind, they replay the scene over and over, adding more emotion each time. Soon, the event is no longer just a memory. It becomes a narrative. And that narrative is what transforms into hatred. They stop seeing it as a single incident and begin to see the person involved as permanently stained, permanently guilty, permanently deserving of punishment. Hatred is born not out of the moment itself, but out of the decision to repeat the moment endlessly in thought. The repetition also adds layers of imagination to the original memory. At first, it is just what happened. But then the mind begins to add what ifs and what should have been. It creates scenarios, imagines motives, and assigns intentions. A person might convince themselves that the offender meant more harm than they actually did. They may build stories in their head about how that person is plotting further, how they have always been against them, how they cannot be trusted ever again. The longer the mind circles around these imagined scenarios, the more hatred grows. It no longer feeds on truth. It feeds on interpretation. And those interpretations get stronger the more they are repeated. Repetition is powerful because the mind believes what it hears often enough. Just like affirmations can shape a person's confidence, repeated negative thoughts can shape a person's hatred. Every time the mind says, "They wronged me," the feeling of bitterness deepens. Every time it says, "They don't deserve forgiveness," the wall grows thicker. Every time it replays the scene of betrayal, it's as if the wound has been cut open again. The mind cannot tell the difference between memory and present experience when it is fed often enough, and so the hatred feels alive, current, and fresh. Even if the original event happened years ago, hatred grows through repetition because the person carrying it refuses release. They refuse to let the thought pass. Instead, they invite it back in, entertain it, nurture it until it becomes a constant presence. They may go about their day working, eating, talking, but in the background of their mind, the same tape is playing. And the more it plays, the stronger the emotional connection becomes. Hatred in this way is not passive. It is practiced. It is trained into the mind the way a musician trains their fingers on an instrument or an athlete trains their body for performance. The mind becomes skilled at recalling bitterness quickly and easily because it has been rehearsed so many times. What makes this repetition so dangerous is that it begins to influence identity. At first, hatred is about an event or a person. But with enough repetition, it becomes part of who someone thinks they are. They begin to see themselves as the victim, as the one who was wronged, as the one who cannot forgive. They take on hatred as a part of their identity, saying things like, "I'll never forget what they did," or "I can never forgive that person." And because they repeat it often enough, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like truth. They can't imagine life without that narrative because it has become part of how they define themselves. This cycle of repetition doesn't just stay in the mind. It begins to seep into actions, attitudes, and behaviors. Hatred colors how people speak, how they treat others, how they make decisions. They may become more suspicious, more defensive, more cold-hearted. Even when dealing with people who had nothing to do with the original wound, the hatred spills over, affecting relationships, trust, and connection. All of it stems from the fact that the same thought has been repeated so many times that it has built an emotional prison. Another layer to this repetition is the way it connects with others. People who carry hatred often seek out others who will agree with them. They repeat the story to friends, family, or co-workers, each time reinforcing the bitterness. Every retelling makes the hatred feel more justified, more valid, more permanent. They may even exaggerate details or emphasize certain parts to gain sympathy or agreement. And once others agree, the hatred gains more power because now it has external confirmation. The repetition moves from the private mind into public conversation where it grows even stronger. The irony of hatred fed by repetition is that the one who carries it believes they are hurting the other person by holding on. But in truth, they are hurting themselves the most. Every repeated thought keeps them stuck in the past, chained to the memory, unable to move forward. Their mind is trapped in cycles, and every cycle deepens the bitterness. Hatred thrives on this cycle, and the more it is repeated, the harder it becomes to imagine life without it. It becomes normal. It becomes expected. It becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. That is why hatred is not sudden but cultivated. It grows slowly but powerfully through the endless repetition of thoughts that should have been released long ago. Hatred is not a solitary force. It does not stay contained within the heart of the person who carries it. Instead, it spreads like smoke filling a room or a virus passing from one host to another. Anger often burns out within the individual, but hatred is contagious. It moves from person to person, from family to family, from one group into an entire society. This is why hatred is far more dangerous than anger, because its influence multiplies. One person's bitterness can infect an entire environment, poisoning relationships, creating division, and shaping the culture around them. What begins as one person's private resentment often ends as a collective mindset. When someone holds hatred inside, they rarely keep it locked away forever. The weight of it pushes them to speak, to share, to release pieces of it to others. They talk to their friends, telling their version of the story, passing along their pain like a torch. They look for others who will agree with them, who will validate their feelings, who will join them in despising the same person or the same group. And when they find that agreement, hatred grows stronger because it has now spread beyond the individual. It has taken root in someone else's heart, and now two minds are feeding the same fire. This is why hatred in families is so destructive. One parent can plant hatred in the heart of a child by constantly repeating stories of betrayal, rejection, or conflict. The child grows up carrying wounds that were never theirs to begin with, hating someone they may have never even truly known. The cycle continues because hatred has been passed down like inheritance. Instead of wealth or wisdom, what is given from one generation to the next is bitterness. That child may then pass it further to their own children, and before long, hatred has outlived the original offense by decades or even centuries. Entire bloodlines can remain divided because hatred proved itself contagious. Hatred also spreads in workplaces and communities. One person who secretly despises a colleague can influence others through subtle conversations, sarcastic remarks, or the spreading of rumors. Soon, people who had no conflict at all begin to feel negativity toward the target. Hatred manipulates perception. It doesn't only affect how the carrier sees the world, it persuades others to adopt the same distorted view. This is how reputations are destroyed, how teams collapse, how trust is broken. A single bitter voice can make an entire group toxic because hatred whispers and persuades until it multiplies. On a larger scale, history itself shows the contagious nature of hatred. Wars, conflicts, and divisions between nations have often been fueled not by anger in the moment, but by hatred passed down over generations. Anger might cause a battle, but hatred sustains the war. It convinces people to see entire groups as enemies, to view entire nations as threats, to justify violence and cruelty. Hatred spreads through speeches, through propaganda, through stories told again and again, until they shape collective identity. What was once one person's hatred can turn into a movement, and what was once a private wound can turn into the justification for widespread destruction. The contagious nature of hatred lies in its ability to disguise itself as loyalty or justice. When a person shares their bitterness, they often present it as truth, as righteousness, as protection. Others who listen may feel compelled to join in, thinking they are standing for what is right, when in reality they are simply inheriting hatred that was never theirs. That is how entire groups get caught in cycles of prejudice, racism, or revenge. They adopt the hatred of others without ever questioning its roots. Hatred also spreads because it feeds off attention. The more it is spoken of, the more it grows. Every time someone repeats their story of betrayal with venom in their tone, they are not just feeding their own bitterness. They are planting seeds in the minds of those who listen. Even if the listener doesn't fully agree, the story lingers in their thoughts, shaping their perception subtly. Over time, small seeds of suspicion can turn into full-grown trees of hatred, and the cycle continues without end. And unlike anger, which is easy to spot, hatred can spread quietly. It doesn't always come in the form of loud words or obvious hostility. Sometimes it spreads in sarcasm, in half-truths, in subtle negativity. Sometimes it spreads through silence, by withholding kindness, by creating distance, by making others feel unwanted. Because hatred is patient, it doesn't need to spread quickly, it spreads consistently. Like a slow-moving poison, it seeps into relationships and communities until it feels normal, until division feels natural, until bitterness feels justified. The danger of hatred being contagious is that it doesn't just destroy the target, it destroys the carriers along the way. When hatred spreads, it creates an atmosphere where trust dies, where cooperation weakens, and where love struggles to survive. Everyone involved loses something: peace, joy, clarity, or connection. Hatred multiplies pain far beyond the original source, pulling innocent people into a conflict they never asked for. And once it spreads wide enough, it becomes difficult to trace back to where it began, because now it exists in everyone who has been infected by it. This is why hatred cannot be underestimated. It may begin in one person's heart, but it never stays there. It seeks out others, it pulls them in, it convinces them to adopt the same bitterness. It moves through conversations, through actions, through generations. Unlike anger, which tends to rise and fall within the same individual, hatred grows by multiplication. It builds networks, it forms alliances, it creates collective resentment. And once it has spread, it is no longer one person's battle. It becomes the environment in which everyone must live. Hatred is not always expressed with loud words or explosive actions. More often, it hides in silence, secrecy, and subtle strategies that work in the shadows. One of the most dangerous signs of real hatred is the way it operates indirectly, creating traps without confrontation, planning harm without exposure, and plotting destruction while maintaining an outward mask of civility. Unlike anger, which shouts, reacts, and makes itself visible, hatred cloaks itself under layers of calmness, pretending to be neutral while internally sharpening its weapons. It is like poison placed in a cup of water, colorless, tasteless, yet lethal. You may drink it without awareness, only to feel its effects later when the damage has already been done. This quiet, calculated nature makes hatred